The first thing that felt wrong was the silence when I came home from work on a Thursday evening in March. Not the peaceful quiet of an empty house, but the heavy, guilty silence that follows a secret. I stood in the entryway of my suburban home in Millbrook Heights, car keys still in my hand, calling out for Rusty. My golden retriever always greeted me at the door, his entire body wiggling with excitement, tags jingling as he bounded toward me with his favorite tennis ball. But tonight there was nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The house felt different without that familiar rush of paws on hardwood floors, without the warm weight of Rusty pressing against my legs as I hung up my coat. I called his name again, louder this time, walking through the living room where my younger sister Emma sat curled on the couch with her laptop, deliberately not looking up at me. "Where's Rusty?" I asked, setting down my purse on the coffee table. Emma's fingers froze over her keyboard for just a moment before she resumed typing with forced casualness. "He's probably upstairs sleeping in Mom's room. You know how he likes her comforter." Something in her tone made my stomach tighten, but I pushed the feeling aside and headed upstairs. My mother's bedroom door was closed, which was unusual for this time of evening. I knocked softly before entering, finding Mom sitting at her vanity, removing her earrings with the same deliberate focus Emma had shown downstairs. "Mom, where's Rusty?" I asked, scanning the room for any sign of my dog. The bed was perfectly made, no telltale depression where a 70-pound retriever might have been napping. She turned to face me, and for a split second, I saw something flicker across her expression before she smiled. "Oh honey, he's at the groomer's. I decided to treat him to a full spa day. He'll be back tomorrow afternoon, all clean and trimmed." "The groomers?" I frowned, but I didn't schedule an appointment, and they usually require 24 hours notice for full services. "Which groomer did you take him to?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She fumbled with her jewelry box, avoiding my eyes. "That new place on Elm Street, Pampered Paws, I think it's called. They had a cancellation." I'd lived in Millbrook Heights for 6 years, ever since moving back home after my divorce, to help with expenses and keep Mom company after Dad passed. I knew every business on Elm Street, and there was no grooming salon called Pampered Paws. The closest groomer was Barks and Bubbles, 3 towns over, and they certainly didn't offer overnight services. "Mom," I said slowly, "there's no grooming place called Pampered Paws on Elm Street." Her hands stilled on her earrings. "Oh, you're right, I misspoke. It's that place in Riverside. You know the one." But I could see the lie forming in real time, could see her scrambling for explanations that didn't add up. My mother had always been a terrible liar, her tells as obvious as neon signs. The way she couldn't meet my eyes, the slight tremor in her voice, the way she kept fidgeting with objects on her vanity. I left her room without another word and went straight to mine, closing the door behind me as my mind raced. Rusty hadn't been at a groomer's, but where was he? And why were Mom and Emma lying about it? I sat on my bed, staring at the empty dog bed in the corner where Rusty slept every night. The bed I'd bought him when he was just a puppy, barely 8 weeks old and small enough to curl up in my lap. I'd rescued him from the animal shelter 4 years ago, during the darkest period of my life when my marriage was falling apart and I was struggling to rebuild my sense of self. Rusty had been my constant companion through the divorce proceedings, through the difficult decision to move back home, through the adjustment period of living with family again as a 32-year-old woman. He'd been my morning running partner, my evening confidant, my source of unconditional love during a time when I'd questioned whether I was capable of being loved at all. The thought that something might have happened to him made my chest tighten with panic. I grabbed my phone and called the 3 grooming salons within a reasonable driving distance. None of them had any record of a golden retriever named Rusty being brought in today. None of them even knew my mother. Downstairs, I could hear muffled conversation between Mom and Emma, their voices too low to make out words but urgent in tone. I crept to the top of the stairs, straining to listen. "She's going to find out eventually," Emma was saying, her voice stressed and higher than usual. "Not if we stick to the story," Mom replied firmly. "It's better this way. She'll understand once she calms down and thinks about it logically." "Better what way? What story?" My heart started pounding as the implications of their conversation sank in. They weren't just hiding something from me. They'd done something they thought I would be upset about, something involving Rusty. I crept back to my room and sat heavily on my bed, trying to piece together what might have happened. Had Rusty been injured? Was he at an emergency vet clinic? But that wouldn't explain the lies about grooming appointments. If he'd been hurt, they would have called me immediately, wouldn't they? Unless they were responsible for whatever had happened to him. The thought hit me like a physical blow. Had there been an accident? Had they left a gate open, let him run into traffic? Were they lying because they were afraid to tell me the truth about something terrible that had occurred? I pulled out my phone again and started calling veterinary clinics, emergency animal hospitals, anywhere Rusty might have been taken if he'd been injured. Each call yielded the same result. No golden retriever matching his description had been brought in today. By 10 o'clock that night, I'd exhausted every logical explanation for Rusty's absence. He wasn't at a groomer's, wasn't at a vet clinic, wasn't lost somewhere in the neighborhood. The lies Mom and Emma had told me were becoming more apparent with each phone call I made, each dead end I encountered. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening for any sound that might indicate Rusty's return. The jingle of his collar, the click of his nails on the floor, even the soft sigh he made when he settled into his bed for the night. But the house remained eerily quiet, missing the familiar sounds of my companion's presence. Sleep came in restless fragments, interrupted by anxiety and the growing certainty that something was very wrong. I woke up several times convinced I'd heard Rusty's bark, only to realize it was my imagination creating the sounds I desperately wanted to hear. The next morning, I came downstairs to find Mom already in the kitchen, making coffee with the same forced normalcy I'd seen from Emma the night before. She looked up as I entered, her smile too bright, too deliberate. "Good morning, sweetheart. Sleep well. Where's Rusty, Mom?" I asked without preamble, pouring myself a cup of coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. "I told you he's at the groomer's, should be home this afternoon. I called every grooming salon within 30 miles yesterday," I said, watching her face carefully. "None of them have ever heard of Rusty, or seen a golden retriever matching his description." The coffee mug in her hands trembled slightly. "Maybe I got the name wrong. You know how bad I am with business names. What's the real story, Mom? What happened to my dog?" For a moment her facade cracked completely. I saw guilt, defensiveness, and something else. Resignation, maybe, or the relief that comes from no longer having to maintain a lie. But then she straightened her shoulders, and the mask slipped back into place. "Nothing happened to Rusty, Natalie. He's perfectly fine. You're being paranoid and dramatic just like you were during the divorce. Not everything is a conspiracy." The comparison to my divorce stung, mostly because it was such an obvious deflection. Mom had often accused me of being too suspicious, too untrusting during the breakdown of my marriage, even when my instincts had been proven right about my ex-husband's infidelity. I spent that Friday in a state of controlled panic, calling more veterinary clinics, checking with local animal shelters, even posting on neighborhood social media groups, asking if anyone had seen a golden retriever. Each inquiry yielded nothing, but I couldn't stop myself from searching. The alternative, accepting that something terrible had happened, and my own family was lying to me about it, was too devastating to contemplate. When I arrived home from work that evening, I immediately noticed that Rusty's food and water bowls had been removed from their usual spot in the kitchen. His leash was no longer hanging by the back door. The living room had been rearranged slightly, and his favorite rope toy was nowhere to be seen. They were erasing him from the house. The realization hit me with sickening clarity. This wasn't about an accident or an emergency vet visit. This was deliberate, systematic. They were removing all traces of Rusty from our home, as if he'd never existed. I confronted Mom immediately, finding her in the living room watching television with Emma, both of them pointedly avoiding eye contact when I walked in. "Where are Rusty's things?" I demanded, my voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. "What things?" Mom asked, but her performance was weaker now, less convincing. "His bowls, his leash, his toys. Everything's been moved."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Emma spoke up for the first time since I'd been asking questions. We thought we'd pack them up while he's away. Keep the house tidy. Pack them up for what? How long exactly do you think grooming takes? The silence that followed was deafening. Emma looked at Mom. Mom looked at the television screen. And I stood there feeling like the foundation of my world was crumbling beneath my feet. I want the truth, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Right now. What did you do with Rusty? Mom turned off the television and looked at me directly for the first time since this ordeal began. Her expression was a mixture of defiance and guilt. The look of someone who knows they've done something wrong but believes they were justified in doing it. We found him a new home, she said finally. A family with a big yard and children who can give him the attention he deserves. The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually staggered backward, gripping the doorframe to keep from falling. You what? I whispered. He was unhappy here, Natalie. You're gone 12 hours a day at work. You barely have time to walk him properly, and he's been acting out. Chewing furniture, having accidents in the house. We found a family who can take better care of him. That's not true, I said. My voice getting stronger as shock gave way to fury. Rusty hasn't had an accident in the house in over a year, and the only thing he's ever chewed was a corner of the couch cushion when he was still a puppy. You're lying. We're not lying, Emma interjected, but her voice lacked conviction. We did what was best for everyone. Best for everyone. I repeated incredulously. You sold my dog without my permission. You gave away my companion, my family member, to strangers. How is that best for anyone except people who apparently couldn't stand having a dog in the house? The truth was starting to emerge through their weak justifications. This hadn't been about Rusty's welfare. This had been about their convenience, their preferences, their decision that my dog was an inconvenience they no longer wanted to tolerate. We didn't sell him, Mom said quickly. We found him a good home through a rescue organization. There was no money involved. Another lie. I could see it in her eyes, in the way she avoided looking directly at me when she spoke. They had sold him, taken money for my dog like he was a piece of furniture they'd decided to get rid of. I need their contact information, I said, pulling out my phone. I'm getting him back right now. You can't, Emma said quickly. The adoption is final. They've already bonded with him. Adoption? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You can't adopt out a dog that doesn't belong to you. Rusty is registered in my name. His veterinary records are in my name. You had no legal right to give him away. That's when I saw the fear creep into their expressions. They hadn't considered the legal implications of what they'd done. They'd treated my dog like community property, something they could dispose of without consequences. I want the family's contact information, I repeated, my voice deadly calm, and I want it now. We don't have it, Mom said, but the lie was so obvious it was almost insulting. The rescue organization handles all the contact. What rescue organization? Another moment of silent panic between them. Second Chances Animal Rescue, Emma said finally. They're based in Hartwell. I pulled up the organization's website on my phone while they watched nervously. Second Chances Animal Rescue did exist, and they did handle pet adoptions, but a quick call to their emergency line revealed that they had no record of a golden retriever named Rusty being surrendered for adoption in the past week. When I relayed this information to Mom and Emma, their last pretense of legitimacy crumbled. Fine, Mom said, her voice sharp with defensive anger. We sold him to a family we found through an online ad. They paid us $800, and he's better off with them than he was here. $800. They'd sold my dog, my companion, my emotional support system for $800, and lied to me about it for 2 days. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I couldn't speak for several minutes. I just stood there, looking at these two people I'd trusted completely, people I'd moved back home to help and support, and tried to process the magnitude of what they'd done. You sold my dog, I finally managed to say. You sold my dog to strangers for money, and lied to me about it. He's just a dog, Natalie, Emma said, and those 4 words revealed everything I needed to know about how differently we viewed Rusty's place in our family. He's not just a dog, I said, my voice rising. He's my dog, he's my companion, my responsibility, my family. You had no right to make that decision for me. We had every right, Mom shot back. This is our house too, and we were tired of dealing with the smell, the hair, the constant need for attention. You treat that animal better than you treat your own family." The accusation was so unfair, so completely divorced from reality, that I almost laughed. I'd moved back home to help them financially after Dad's death. I'd given up my independence, my privacy, my own space to be here for them. And they'd repaid that sacrifice by selling the one thing that brought me comfort and joy. "I need the family's contact information," I said again. "I'm not asking anymore. I'm telling you, give me their information so I can get my dog back." "Even if we wanted to," Mom said, "we can't." The transaction was handled through an intermediary. We never met the family directly. What intermediary? A woman named Patricia Mills. She connects families who need to rehome pets with families looking to adopt. Everything went through her. I immediately began searching for Patricia Mills online, but found dozens of women with that name in our area. Without more specific information, it would be impossible to identify which one had facilitated the sale of my dog. "What else do you know about her?" I demanded. "Phone number, address, anything." "We only communicated through email," Emma said, "and we deleted the correspondence after the transaction was complete." Of course they had. Every answer they gave me seemed designed to make it as difficult as possible for me to track down Rusty's location. Whether this was intentional, or just the result of their careless approach to selling my dog, the effect was the same. My companion had vanished into a maze of intermediaries, and deleted communications. That night, I lay in bed staring at the empty dog bed in the corner of my room, and tried to figure out my next steps. The police were unlikely to help with what they'd consider a civil matter between family members. Small claims court might eventually award me monetary damages, but it wouldn't bring Rusty back. I needed to find Patricia Mills and the family who had my dog. I needed to understand exactly how this transaction had taken place, and whether there was any legal recourse available to me. But most importantly, I needed to accept that my own family had betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible. They'd taken the thing I loved most in the world, and sold it for money, then lied to me about it with the same casual indifference they might show for selling an old television or unwanted furniture. In their minds, Rusty had been disposable, an inconvenience to be eliminated, rather than a family member to be cherished. The next morning, I began my investigation in earnest. I searched every online marketplace, where pets might be advertised, looking for any mention of golden retrievers or families seeking to adopt dogs in the past week. I called every veterinary clinic in a 50-mile radius, asking if they'd had any new golden retriever patients registered recently. I spent my lunch break at work calling pet supply stores, asking if they'd had any customers purchasing new dog supplies for a golden retriever. I checked with local dog trainers, groomers, even pet photographers, anyone who might have come into contact with a family who'd recently acquired a new dog. Each inquiry led nowhere, but I couldn't stop searching. Somewhere out there, Rusty was living with strangers who had no idea that he'd been stolen from someone who loved him. He was probably confused, maybe scared, wondering why I'd abandoned him. The thought of his confusion, his possible distress at being separated from me, made it almost impossible to focus on anything else. I found myself checking my phone constantly, hoping for some miraculous message that would lead me to him. By the end of the week, I'd exhausted every obvious avenue of investigation. Patricia Mills remained a ghost, untraceable through normal channels. The family who had Rusty could be anywhere within a 100-mile radius, possibly even farther if they'd been willing to travel for the right dog. That's when I decided to contact my lawyer. David Chen had handled my divorce 2 years earlier with professionalism and competence. More importantly, he'd believed me when I'd told him about my ex-husband's hidden assets and suspicious financial behavior, even when the evidence was circumstantial. If anyone could help me navigate the legal complexities of this situation, it would be David. His office was located in a converted Victorian house downtown, the kind of place that managed to feel both professional and welcoming. When I called to explain my situation, his assistant scheduled an emergency appointment for that same afternoon. "Natalie," David said as I settled into the familiar chair across from his desk, "tell me everything that happened from the beginning." I laid out the entire story, from Rusty's mysterious absence to my family's elaborate lies to the eventual admission that they'd sold him to strangers. David listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "This is more complex than a simple theft case," he said when I finished. "Because your family members are also residents of the property where the dog was kept, there are questions about their authority to make decisions regarding animals on the premises. But Rusty is registered in my name," I protested. "All his veterinary records, his license, everything is in my name." "That definitely strengthens your position," David agreed, "but we need to consider the practical aspects of recovery. Even if we can prove that the sale was illegal, finding the current owners and convincing them to return the dog could be challenging." He leaned back in his chair, studying his notes. "However, there is one approach that might be effective. If we can demonstrate that your family committed fraud by misrepresenting their ownership of the dog, we might be able to pursue both civil and criminal charges. That could provide leverage to encourage cooperation in returning the animal." "What kind of charges?" I asked. "Theft by conversion, fraud, possibly even conspiracy if we can prove they planned this deception. The monetary value of the dog, $800, puts this in felony territory in this state." The thought of pursuing criminal charges against my own mother and sister made my stomach turn, but the alternative was accepting that Rusty was gone forever. "What would you need to build a case?" I asked. "First, we need to document everything. Every lie they told you, every inconsistency in their story, any evidence of premeditation. Second, we need to try to trace the transaction. Find this Patricia Mills woman and the family who has your dog." "How do we do that?" David smiled for the first time since I'd entered his office. "We start with a demand letter. We inform your family that they have 72 hours to provide complete information about the sale, including contact details for all parties involved, or we'll be filing criminal charges for theft and fraud." "The nuclear option," I said quietly. "Sometimes it's the only option that gets results. People who are willing to lie to your face about something this significant are unlikely to cooperate unless they understand the serious legal consequences they're facing." That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with David's draft demand letter, reading through the formal legal language that transformed my personal betrayal into a matter of law. The letter was precise, professional, and absolutely devastating in its implications for Mom and Emma. It detailed their criminal exposure, outlined the evidence we'd gathered, and demanded complete disclosure of all information related to Rusty's sale within 72 hours. It also included a deadline for his return, and a warning that failure to comply would result in immediate filing of criminal charges. When I handed the letter to Mom and Emma the next morning, their reactions told me everything I needed to know about the seriousness of their situation. Mom's face went completely white as she read through the legal document. Emma actually started crying when she reached the section about potential jail time for felony theft. "This is insane, Natalie," Mom said, her voice shaking. "You're threatening to send your own family to prison over a dog." "You sold my dog illegally and lied to me about it for a week," I replied. "This isn't about revenge, it's about getting Rusty back and making sure you understand that what you did was a crime." "We can't give you information we don't have," Emma protested through her tears. "We told you the truth about Patricia Mills." "Then we have a problem," I said calmly, "because if you can't provide that information within 72 hours, my lawyer will be filing criminal charges on Monday morning." The weekend that followed was the most tense and uncomfortable period I'd ever experienced in my family home. Mom and Emma huddled together, making whispered phone calls and spending hours on their computers, presumably trying to track down information they claimed not to have. I gave them space to work while maintaining a polite but distant demeanor. I'd said everything I needed to say in the demand letter. Now it was up to them to decide whether they preferred cooperation or criminal prosecution. On Sunday evening, just hours before the deadline expired, Emma knocked on my bedroom door. "We found her," she said quietly. "Patricia Mills, and we have the family's contact information." Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I had to sit down. "They live in Brookhaven, about 40 miles from here," Emma continued. "Their name is Rodriguez, and they have 2 young children. Patricia Mills confirmed that they still have Rusty and that he's doing well." "I want to call them right now," I said, reaching for my phone. "There's a problem," Emma said quickly. "They don't know that the sale was illegal. Patricia Mills told them that we were the dog's owners and that we were rehoming him because of family circumstances. They paid $800 in good faith, and they've already fallen in love with him. So we explain the situation and offer to reimburse them, I said. Problem solved. It might not be that simple. They've renamed him Max, and their children are already attached. Patricia Mills warned them that someone might come forward claiming to be the dog's previous owner, but she told them it was probably someone who had abandoned the dog and was now having second thoughts. The elaborate deception was even worse than I'd imagined. Not only had my family sold my dog illegally, but they'd created a fictional backstory that painted me as an irresponsible owner, who'd given up my pet and was now trying to reclaim him out of guilt or caprice. That's slander, I said, my legal vocabulary expanding under David's influence. They can't make false statements about my character to justify their theft. What do you want to do? Emma asked. Do you want us to call the Rodriguez family and try to explain? No, I said firmly. This has gone far beyond a family disagreement. We're handling this through legal channels now. The next morning, I met with David to discuss our next steps. Armed with contact information for both Patricia Mills and the Rodriguez family, we could now pursue direct negotiation while maintaining the threat of criminal prosecution as leverage. I think our best approach is a three-pronged strategy, David explained. First, we contact Patricia Mills and inform her that she facilitated the sale of stolen property. Second, we reach out to the Rodriguez family directly to explain the situation and offer restitution. Third, we maintain pressure on your family members to cooperate fully in recovery efforts. What if the Rodriguez family refuses to give Rusty back? I asked. Then we pursue legal action against all parties involved. But most people, when they understand they've unknowingly purchased stolen property, are willing to cooperate in making things right. David crafted careful letters to both Patricia Mills and the Rodriguez family, explaining the situation and requesting their cooperation in returning Rusty to his legal owner. The letters were firm but respectful, acknowledging that they had acted in good faith, while making clear that possession of stolen property, regardless of intent, created legal obligations for them. While we waited for responses to those letters, I tried to return to some semblance of normal life. Work provided a welcome distraction, but evenings at home were unbearable. The absence of Rusty's presence, the knowledge that he was living with strangers just 40 miles away, the ongoing tension with Mom and Emma, all combined to create an atmosphere of constant stress. I started staying later at the office, volunteering for overtime projects, anything to avoid being in a house that no longer felt like home. The betrayal had fundamentally changed my relationship with my family, creating a distance that I wasn't sure could ever be bridged. On Wednesday afternoon, David called with an update. We heard back from Patricia Mills, he said. She's acknowledged that she was not aware of the ownership dispute and has agreed to provide full documentation of the transaction. She's also contacted the Rodriguez family to explain the situation. What was their response? I asked. They want to meet with you, David said. Tomorrow afternoon, if possible. They're coming to my office to discuss the situation face to face. The prospect of finally confronting the people who had my dog filled me with equal parts hope and anxiety. These weren't villains who had deliberately stolen Rusty, they were a family who had paid money for a pet they believed was being legally rehomed. But they also had something that belonged to me, something I needed back more than they could possibly understand. Thursday afternoon found me sitting in David's conference room, nervously checking my watch as I waited for the Rodriguez family to arrive. David had suggested that my mother and sister also attend the meeting, both to provide their account of events and to face the consequences of their actions directly. Mom and Emma sat at the opposite end of the table, both looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact with me. The family dynamic that had once been warm and supportive now felt strained and artificial, as if we were strangers forced together by circumstances rather than people who had chosen to share a home. At exactly 2 o'clock, David's assistant showed the Rodriguez family into the conference room. Maria and Carlos Rodriguez appeared to be in their early 30s, both dressed professionally but casually. Behind them walked 2 children, a boy of perhaps 8 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 5. And between the children, on a familiar red leash, walked Rusty. The sight of my dog, healthy and apparently happy, hit me with such emotional force that I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from standing up immediately. He looked good, well cared for, but when his eyes met mine across the room, his tail began wagging with the same enthusiasm I remembered from every homecoming over the past 4 years. He recognized me, despite whatever name they'd given him, despite the weeks of separation, despite the new family he'd been living with. Rusty knew exactly who I was. "Mrs. Thompson," Maria Rodriguez said as they took seats across from us. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. We had no idea about any of this when we adopted Max." "His name is Rusty," I said gently, unable to keep from looking at my dog as he strained slightly against his leash, clearly wanting to come to me. "Yes, we understand that now," Carlos said. "Patricia Mills explained the situation to us, and we've done some research on our own. We realized that we unknowingly purchased a dog that belonged to someone else." Their willingness to acknowledge the situation honestly was more than I'd expected, and I felt some of my defensive tension begin to ease. "We're not here to cause trouble for anyone," Maria continued. "We just want to do the right thing. But we also need to consider our children, who have become very attached to Rusty in the time he's been with us." "I understand that this is difficult for everyone," I said, choosing my words carefully, "but Rusty has been my companion for 4 years. He was taken from me without my knowledge or consent and sold to you under false pretenses. I appreciate that you acted in good faith, but he needs to come home with me." The little girl, who had been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. "But Max loves us now. He sleeps in my bed and plays fetch with me every day. Why does the lady want to take him away?" The innocence of her question, the genuine confusion and hurt in her voice, made this situation infinitely more complicated than I'd anticipated. These weren't just adults who could understand the legal and ethical complexities involved. These were children who had been allowed to bond with a dog that didn't legally belong to their family. "Sweetheart," Carlos said gently to his daughter, "sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and we have to fix them even when it's hard." Across the table I could see Mom and Emma watching this interaction with obvious discomfort. Their selfish decision to sell my dog had created this painful situation for an innocent family, had put these children in the position of losing a pet they'd grown to love. "We're prepared to return the full purchase price," Maria said to me. "We understand that we have no legal claim to the dog, but we'd like to ask if there's any way we could work out a visitation arrangement, at least for a few weeks while the children adjust to saying goodbye." The request was reasonable and heartfelt, but the thought of continuing to be separated from Rusty, even partially, was almost unbearable. "I appreciate your position," I said finally, "but I think clean separation would be better for everyone, including Rusty. Continued contact would just make the transition more confusing and painful for the children." Maria nodded, tears in her eyes as she looked down at Rusty, who was now lying quietly at her feet but still watching me intently. "We understand," Carlos said. "When would you like us to bring him back to you?" "Now," I said simply, "I'd like to take him home with me today, if that's possible." The next few minutes were a blur of paperwork and logistics. David had prepared transfer documents that officially returned ownership of Rusty to me, while I wrote a check to the Rodriguez family for the full $800 they'd paid, plus an additional $200 to cover any supplies or veterinary care they'd provided. As we prepared to leave, the little girl knelt down next to Rusty and whispered something in his ear. Then she kissed the top of his head and stood up, wiping tears from her face with the back of her hand. "Take good care of Max," she said to me. "He's a really good dog." "I will," I promised her. "And thank you for taking such good care of him while he was with you." Walking out of that conference room with Rusty's leash in my hand felt like emerging from a nightmare. He stayed close to my side as we moved through the building, occasionally looking up at me as if to confirm that this reunion was real. In the parking lot, I knelt down and wrapped my arms around him, burying my face in his familiar fur and breathing in his scent. He pressed against me with the same enthusiasm he'd always shown, his tail wagging so hard his entire back end was wiggling. "I missed you so much," I whispered to him. "I'm so sorry this happened to you." Behind us I could hear Mom and Emma getting into their car for the silent drive home. The legal proceedings were over, the civil matter resolved, but the family relationships damaged by their betrayal would take much longer to heal, if they ever could be repaired. For now though, none of that mattered. I had my dog back, my companion, my family member who had never asked for anything more than love and loyalty in return. As I drove home with Rusty secured in the passenger seat, his head out the window and his ears flapping in the breeze, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Peace. The house felt different when we walked through the front door together. Not just because Rusty was back where he belonged, but because my understanding of what home meant had fundamentally changed. Home wasn't just a place you lived or people you were related to. Home was where you were valued, where your bonds were respected, where your family members couldn't be sold off like possessions when they became inconvenient. I spent that evening re-establishing Rusty's routine, putting his food and water bowls back in their familiar places, retrieving his toys from whatever hiding place Mom and Emma had stashed them in, setting up his bed in the corner of my room where it had always been. He seemed to settle back into the house easily, but I noticed he stayed closer to me than he had before his absence. Whether this was because of confusion about his temporary displacement or simply because he sensed my own need for his constant presence, I couldn't tell. Either way, I was grateful for his devotion. Mom and Emma kept to their own parts of the house for the rest of the week, an arrangement that suited everyone involved. We needed time to process what had happened and decide how, or if, we could move forward as a family after such a fundamental breach of trust. The financial cost of recovering Rusty had been significant. Beyond the $800 I'd reimbursed the Rodriguez family, there were David's legal fees, time off from work for meetings and phone calls, and the emotional toll of weeks of uncertainty and betrayal. The days following Rusty's return settled into a careful routine of avoidance and silent tension. I would wake early, take him for his morning walk while Mom and Emma were still sleeping, then return to prepare for work while they remained conspicuously absent from the kitchen. Evenings followed a similar pattern, with all of us navigating the shared spaces of the house, like strangers trying not to intrude on each other's territory. But beneath this surface calm, I was conducting my own investigation into exactly how the sale of my dog had been orchestrated. The meeting with the Rodriguez family had answered some questions while raising others. Patricia Mills had been surprisingly cooperative in providing documentation, but her records revealed a level of planning and deception that went far beyond a simple impulse decision. The email correspondence between Patricia and my family, which she had forwarded to David at my request, painted a disturbing picture of deliberate manipulation. The initial contact had been made not by Mom or Emma, but by my younger brother Derek, who lived across town and had apparently been complaining about Rusty during family dinners for months. Derek had always been the problem child in our family, the one who borrowed money he never repaid, who showed up uninvited when he needed something, who had a talent for creating drama and then disappearing when consequences arrived. I'd assumed his complaints about Rusty were just typical Derek behavior, attention-seeking negativity that everyone learned to ignore. But according to Patricia's emails, Derek had approached her 6 weeks before Rusty's disappearance, asking about the process for rehoming a dog that belonged to a family member who wasn't taking proper care of it. He'd painted a picture of neglect and abandonment, claiming that I worked excessive hours and left Rusty alone for 12 to 14 hours daily, without adequate exercise or attention. None of this was true, of course. My job required standard business hours, and I had never left Rusty alone for more than 8 hours at a stretch. I took him for runs every morning before work and long walks every evening. On weekends, we often spent entire days at the dog park or hiking trails. But Derek's fictional narrative had provided the justification Patricia needed to feel good about facilitating what she believed was a rescue situation. The correspondence showed that Derek had initially planned to handle the transaction himself, but had convinced Mom and Emma to take over the actual logistics because they lived in the house and would have easier access to Rusty. He'd coached them on what to tell Patricia, what lies to tell me, even what story to prepare for the new family about why the dog was being rehomed. Most disturbingly, Derek had insisted that I never be told the truth about what happened to Rusty. According to his emails, I would be devastated initially, but would eventually move on and probably get another dog. The important thing was that Rusty would be in a better home, and our family would no longer have to deal with the inconvenience of sharing their living space with a large dog. Reading those emails felt like discovering that people I'd trusted completely had been planning my emotional destruction for over a month. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made in a moment of frustration. This was a calculated campaign designed to remove Rusty from my life while ensuring I could never get him back. The financial aspect was equally disturbing. Derek had researched golden retriever prices extensively and had chosen to advertise Rusty for $800 because that amount would be significant enough to attract serious buyers while still being accessible to families with moderate incomes. The money had been split 3 ways, with Derek receiving $300 and Mom and Emma each keeping $250. They had profited from stealing my dog, had turned his sale into a family business venture that funded Derek's car payment, and provided Mom and Emma with spending money for a shopping trip they'd taken the weekend after the transaction was completed. I spent several evenings that week sitting in my room with Rusty, reading through the email chains and trying to process the depth of planning that had gone into betraying me. Every lie they'd told, every misdirection, every moment of feigned confusion when I'd asked about Rusty's whereabouts had been carefully rehearsed and coordinated. They'd even had backup stories prepared in case their initial explanations didn't satisfy me. If the grooming story had fallen apart too quickly, they were prepared to claim that Rusty had been hit by a car and taken to an emergency veterinary clinic in another city. If that story had been challenged, they had a third explanation involving a temporary foster family who was caring for him while I dealt with work stress. The elaborate nature of their deception was almost impressive in its thoroughness, but it also revealed something deeply disturbing about how they viewed me and my relationship with Rusty. They'd been confident that I would believe their lies, that I would accept their explanations without conducting my own investigation, that I would ultimately give up searching for him and move on with my life. They'd underestimated both my determination and my resources, but their willingness to bet against my love for Rusty spoke volumes about how little they understood or respected the bond between us. On Thursday evening, a week after Rusty's return, I finally confronted Derek directly. I'd been debating whether to involve him in the legal proceedings, but decided that understanding his motivations might be more valuable than pursuing additional criminal charges. I called him while sitting in my car outside his apartment complex, Rusty sleeping peacefully in the passenger seat. Derek answered on the third ring, his voice carrying its usual note of casual disinterest. "Hey Nat, what's up? You sound weird. I have Rusty back," I said without preamble. "And I know about your role in selling him." The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to wonder if the call had been dropped. When Derek finally spoke, his tone had shifted from casual to carefully controlled. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the lie was half-hearted, automatic rather than convincing. "Patricia Mills forwarded me all your email correspondence, Derek. I know about the planning, the coaching, the money. I know everything." Another long pause, followed by a sigh that suggested resignation rather than surprise. "Look Nat, it wasn't personal. That dog was causing problems for everyone, and Mom and Emma were getting stressed out dealing with him all the time." "That's not true, and you know it," I replied. "Rusty wasn't causing problems for anyone. You just decided you didn't want him in the family anymore, so you orchestrated his removal without consulting the person who actually owned him." "You're never around anyway," Derek said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "You work all the time, you're always stressed out, and that dog was just another responsibility you couldn't handle properly." His words echoed the justifications I'd read in the emails, the fictional narrative he'd created to make himself feel better about what he'd done. But hearing them spoken aloud, delivered with such casual dismissiveness, made me understand that Derek genuinely believed his own lies about my inability to care for Rusty. "I take excellent care of my dog, Derek. He's healthy, happy, well-trained, and loved. The only problem he was causing was taking up space in a house where you wanted to be able to come and go without dealing with an animal." Derek's response confirmed my suspicion. "Exactly. It's not fair that Mom and Emma have to structure their lives around your pet. They can't have guests over without worrying about dog hair, they can't leave food out without watching it constantly, they can't even relax in their own home because there's always this animal demanding attention. But it's not their home exclusively," I pointed out. "I pay rent, I contribute to household expenses, and Rusty is part of the family I brought to that arrangement. You don't get to unilaterally decide that my family member needs to be eliminated because he's inconvenient. It's just a dog, Nat, Derek said, echoing Emma's earlier sentiment. You're acting like we killed your child or something. Dogs are replaceable. Those words crystallized everything I needed to understand about Derek's perspective and probably about my family's collective attitude toward Rusty. To them, he wasn't a family member with emotional and social needs. He wasn't a companion who had bonded with me through years of shared experiences. He wasn't even really a living being with his own preferences and attachments. He was a possession, a piece of property that could be discarded and replaced like a broken appliance or outgrown furniture. The fact that I loved him, that he loved me, that we had built a relationship based on mutual trust and affection, meant nothing to them because they simply couldn't comprehend that kind of connection with an animal. We're not talking about replacing a coffee maker, Derek. We're talking about stealing a living being who has emotions, memories, and attachments. Rusty wasn't causing anyone problems. You were all just annoyed by his presence and decided to get rid of him rather than having an adult conversation about household arrangements. Derek's voice hardened. Fine, you got your precious dog back. Can we move on now? The whole thing was a mistake, but it's over. No, it's not over, I said firmly. What you, Mom, and Emma did was a crime. You stole my property, sold it for profit, and then lied to me about it for weeks. The fact that I was able to recover Rusty doesn't erase the criminal nature of what you did. You're not seriously thinking about pressing charges against your own family, Derek said, but I could hear uncertainty in his voice. That depends on whether you're willing to take responsibility for your actions and make full restitution for the costs this has caused me. What costs? You got the dog back. I've paid over $2,000 in legal fees, missed work for meetings and phone calls, reimbursed the family who bought him, and dealt with weeks of emotional distress because of your lies. Beyond that, you profited from stealing my property, which is a separate issue entirely. The silence stretched out again as Derek apparently tried to calculate whether cooperation or continued defiance would be more beneficial for him. What exactly are you asking for? He finally said. Full restitution of my costs, plus the $300 you received from the sale, plus a written apology acknowledging what you did and why it was wrong. That's over $2,000, Derek protested. I don't have that kind of money. Then you'll need to work out a payment plan, just like any other debt. The alternative is criminal prosecution for theft, fraud, and conspiracy. Derek tried to negotiate, offering partial payment and claiming that his role had been minimal, that Mom and Emma had been the primary actors in the scheme. But the email evidence contradicted his attempts to minimize his involvement, and I was no longer interested in family drama disguised as excuses. The conversation ended with Derek agreeing to provide written acknowledgement of his role and a payment schedule for restitution. Whether he would actually follow through remained to be seen, but at least he understood that his actions had serious consequences that wouldn't simply disappear because we shared DNA. Similar conversations with Mom and Emma followed over the next few days, each revealing different aspects of their motivations and different levels of willingness to accept responsibility. Mom seemed genuinely remorseful about the deception, claiming she'd gotten swept up in Derek's planning and hadn't fully considered the implications of what they were doing. Emma, on the other hand, remained defensive and accusatory, insisting that I was overreacting and that Rusty was better off having spent time with a family that had more time to devote to him. Her inability to understand why their actions were wrong, combined with her continued resentment about the legal consequences they'd faced, made it clear that our relationship had been permanently damaged. The house dynamic shifted significantly as these conversations progressed. Mom made tentative efforts to normalize our interactions, asking about work, commenting on the weather, trying to rebuild the casual intimacy that had characterized our relationship before Rusty's disappearance. But her attempts felt forced and artificial, as if she were following a script for how family members should behave rather than expressing genuine warmth. Emma retreated into sullen silence, speaking to me only when directly questioned and maintaining an attitude of injured martyrdom that suggested she viewed herself as the victim in this situation. She spent most evenings in her room or out with friends, avoiding the common areas when I was home. The financial arrangements were completed within 2 weeks, with all 3 family members agreeing to payment plans that would provide full restitution over the following 6 months. Derek's payments would be the largest, reflecting both his leadership role in the scheme and his profit from the sale. Mom and Emma's payments were smaller but still significant enough to ensure they understood the real cost of their actions. But money couldn't repair the fundamental trust that had been broken. Living in the same house with people who had been willing to steal from me, lie to me, and cause me weeks of emotional distress created a constant undercurrent of tension that made every interaction feel strained and artificial. I began seriously considering alternative living arrangements for the first time since moving back home. The financial benefits of shared housing costs were significant, but they might not be worth the psychological cost of living with people who had demonstrated such casual disregard for my emotional well-being. The decision was made easier by a conversation I had with my friend Jennifer over lunch on a Friday afternoon. Jennifer had been my closest friend since college, the person I'd called during the worst days of my divorce, the one who had helped me move back home and had supported my decision to prioritize family relationships over independence. She listened carefully as I described the events of the past month, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly just letting me process the emotions that were still too complex for me to fully understand. "I keep thinking I should forgive them and move on," I told her as we shared dessert at our favorite cafe. "They're family, and family is supposed to work through problems together. But every time I look at them, I remember how easily they lied to me, how they were planning my emotional destruction for weeks." Jennifer set down her fork and looked at me directly. "Natalie, what they did wasn't a family problem. It was a crime. If a neighbor had stolen Rusty and sold him, you wouldn't be agonizing over whether to forgive them. You'd expect them to face consequences and you'd probably never speak to them again." "But they're not neighbors," I protested. "They're my mother and siblings, and that makes what they did worse, not better," Jennifer replied firmly. "Family members are supposed to protect each other, not exploit each other for profit. The fact that they were willing to betray you so casually suggests that they don't view your well-being as important as their own convenience." Her words articulated something I'd been struggling to accept. The betrayal wasn't just about Rusty, though losing him had been devastating. It was about the casual way my family had dismissed my feelings, my attachments, my autonomy. They'd made a decision that would profoundly impact my life without consulting me, then lied about it with the assumption that I would never discover the truth. That kind of disrespect and manipulation wasn't something that could be resolved with apologies and payment plans. It revealed fundamental differences in how we viewed relationships, trust, and basic human decency. "Maybe it's time to consider whether living with them is healthy for you," Jennifer suggested gently. "You've been so focused on helping your mom financially and emotionally that you might have overlooked how the arrangement was affecting your own well-being." She was right, of course. I'd moved back home with the best intentions, wanting to provide support during a difficult period, and to rebuild family relationships that had been strained by geographic distance and busy adult lives. But I'd gradually adapted to a dynamic where my needs and preferences were consistently secondary to everyone else's comfort. The house rules had slowly shifted to accommodate Derek's frequent visits, Emma's social activities, and Mom's desire for quiet evenings. Rusty's exercise schedule had been adjusted to minimize disruption to their routines. My work schedule had been criticized when it conflicted with family dinners or planned activities. I'd accepted these adjustments as normal compromises required for harmonious multi-generational living. But now I could see them as part of a pattern where my autonomy was gradually eroded in favor of group convenience. Rusty's sale had been the extreme expression of this dynamic, but it wasn't an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of a relationship where my individual needs were consistently viewed as less important than collective preferences. That weekend I began researching apartments and rental houses in my area, focusing on places that would welcome both me and Rusty. The rental market was competitive, and pet-friendly options were limited, but I found several possibilities that would fit my budget while providing the independence I was beginning to realize I desperately needed. Rusty seemed to sense the shift in my energy and behavior. He'd always been attentive to my moods, but since his return, he'd been almost hyper-vigilant about my emotional state. He followed me more closely than before, often positioning himself between me and other family members, as if he were protecting me from potential threats. During my apartment hunting weekend, he accompanied me to several properties, charming landlords, and demonstrating his excellent behavior in unfamiliar environments. His presence actually helped in some cases, showing potential landlords that he was well trained and socialized rather than the kind of pet who might damage property or disturb neighbors. On Sunday evening, I sat in my room with rental applications spread across my desk and Rusty lying at my feet. The decision to move out felt both necessary and heartbreaking. I genuinely wanted to rebuild my family relationships, to create a supportive environment where we could all thrive together. But trust once broken creates a foundation too unstable for genuine intimacy. Every conversation with Mom and Emma now carried the subtext of their willingness to deceive me. Every family gathering would be shadowed by the memory of their casual betrayal. Every decision they made regarding shared household matters would be viewed through the lens of their demonstrated disregard for my feelings and autonomy. Moving out wouldn't solve all these problems, but it would eliminate the daily stress of navigating relationships with people who had proven themselves untrustworthy. It would give me space to process what had happened without constantly being reminded of it by their presence. Most importantly, it would ensure that Rusty and I could build a life together without worrying about the preferences and prejudices of people who viewed him as disposable property rather than a beloved family member. On Monday morning, I submitted applications for 2 different apartments, both pet-friendly, both within my budget, both available for immediate occupancy. I also scheduled a meeting with my supervisor to discuss the possibility of working from home several days per week, an arrangement that would reduce my commute time and allow me to spend more time with Rusty. The conversation with my supervisor went better than expected. My work performance had always been strong, and the nature of my job in financial analysis was well suited to remote work arrangements. We agreed on a schedule that would have me in the office 3 days per week and working from home the other 2 days, pending a trial period to ensure the arrangement worked for everyone involved. This schedule would address one of Derek's few legitimate criticisms about my care for Rusty. Instead of being alone for 8 hours on weekdays, he would have company for at least 2 days each week. The arrangement would also reduce my transportation costs and allow me to maintain a higher rent budget for an apartment that met both our needs. By Wednesday, I'd received approval for my first choice apartment, a 1-bedroom unit in a complex that featured a large dog park and walking trails. The rent was higher than my current contribution to household expenses, but the increased work flexibility and elimination of family-related stress made the financial stretch worthwhile. The apartment was available for move-in the following weekend, which meant I had less than a week to organize the logistics of relocating while managing work responsibilities and avoiding unnecessary drama with my family. I decided to wait until Thursday evening to inform Mom and Emma about my decision to move out. By then, all the arrangements would be finalized, making it impossible for them to argue or negotiate their way into changing my mind. I'd learned from the Rusty situation that advance notice of my decisions gave people too much opportunity to undermine or manipulate my choices. Thursday dinner was particularly awkward, with all of us making stilted conversation about work and weather while carefully avoiding any mention of the recent upheaval in our family dynamics. Mom had prepared my favorite meal, possibly as a peace offering, but the gesture felt hollow given the circumstances. After we'd finished eating, and Emma had disappeared to her room, I helped Mom clear the dishes while gathering the courage to explain my decision. "I'll be moving out this weekend," I said as I loaded plates into the dishwasher. Mom dropped the serving spoon she'd been holding, the clatter against the ceramic tile floor punctuating the sudden silence. "Moving out? Why? I thought we were working through our problems." "We've been working through the legal and financial aspects," I replied carefully. "But I don't think we can work through the trust issues while living in the same house." She bent to retrieve the spoon, using the action to avoid eye contact. "Natalie, I know what we did was wrong, but it's over now. You have Rusty back, everyone's paying restitution, and we've all learned from our mistakes. Can't we just move forward?" Her words revealed the fundamental disconnect between our perspectives. She viewed the betrayal as a discrete incident that could be resolved through apologies and payment plans. I viewed it as evidence of attitudes and dynamics that made continued cohabitation unworkable. "It's not about punishment, Mom. It's about creating an environment where Rusty and I can feel secure and respected. Right now, I can't trust that you and Emma won't make decisions about our lives without consulting me." Mom finished loading the remaining dishes, her movements sharp with suppressed emotion. "So you're abandoning the family, because we made one mistake." "I'm not abandoning anyone," I replied. "I'm choosing to live independently so that our relationships can heal without the daily stress of shared living arrangements." "What about our financial arrangement?" Mom asked, her voice taking on a note of panic. "I was counting on your rent contribution to help with the mortgage." This was the question I'd been dreading, but also the one I'd prepared for most carefully. Mom's financial situation had been one of the primary reasons I'd moved back home, and I didn't want my departure to create genuine hardship for her. "I've calculated what my share of utilities and household expenses has been, beyond rent," I explained. "I'll continue contributing that amount for the next 3 months while you adjust your budget or find a new roommate. That should give you time to explore your options without creating an immediate crisis." Mom's relief was visible, but it was quickly replaced by renewed concern. 3 months isn't very long to find someone reliable to rent Emma's old room. "Emma still lives here," I pointed out, "and Derek could contribute something if he's going to continue treating this as his second home." The suggestion was reasonable but clearly unwelcome. Mom had always been reluctant to ask her children for financial support, preferring to struggle independently rather than burden us with her obligations. But Rusty's sale had altered my perspective on family responsibilities and fairness. If Derek was comfortable enough with the household to orchestrate the sale of my dog, he was comfortable enough to contribute to household expenses. If Emma was going to remain living here as an adult, she could take on a larger share of financial responsibilities rather than treating Mom's home as subsidized housing. "I've already discussed this with both of them," I continued. "Derek's restitution payments will be redirected to help with your mortgage, and Emma's agreed to increase her contribution to cover some of the shortfall from my departure." This wasn't entirely true yet, but I planned to have those conversations before the weekend. Both Derek and Emma owed me money for their roles in Rusty's sale, and both of them had benefited from my financial contributions to the household over the past 2 years. Asking them to step up in my absence was reasonable and overdue. The rest of the conversation proceeded more smoothly than I'd anticipated. Mom asked practical questions about my new living arrangements, offered to help with the moving process, and made tentative suggestions about maintaining regular contact after my departure. Emma's reaction when I spoke with her later that evening was less gracious but equally resigned. She'd apparently been expecting my departure ever since the legal proceedings began, and had already started making plans to take over my larger bedroom once I moved out. Her casual assumption that my departure would benefit her illustrated the selfishness that had made living together increasingly difficult. Rather than viewing my move as a loss for the family, she saw it as an opportunity to upgrade her own living situation. Derek's response when I called him Friday morning was typically focused on how my decisions would affect him. "So I'm supposed to start paying Mom's bills now because you can't handle living with family. You're supposed to contribute to expenses for a house you use regularly and whose occupants you've been comfortable manipulating," I replied, evenly. "That's different," Derek protested. "I don't live there officially. But you eat there several times a week, use the laundry facilities, and apparently feel entitled to make decisions about household pets," I pointed out. "If you want the privileges of family membership, you need to accept the responsibilities." The conversation devolved into familiar patterns of Derek making excuses and demands, while I maintained firm boundaries about my expectations. Eventually he agreed to redirect his restitution payments to Mom, rather than to me, which would provide her with some additional income, while still ensuring that he faced consequences for his actions. Friday evening was spent packing my belongings and Rusty's supplies, a process that revealed how much I'd accumulated during 2 years of shared living. Books, kitchen gadgets, furniture, clothes, and Rusty's extensive collection of toys and equipment filled more boxes than I'd anticipated. Mom and Emma helped with the packing process, both seeming to view the activity as a bonding opportunity rather than preparation for separation. Their cheerful assistance felt somewhat surreal, given the circumstances, but I appreciated their practical support, even if their emotional responses remained puzzling. Rusty supervised the packing process with obvious interest, seeming to understand that significant changes were coming. He'd always been sensitive to luggage and moving boxes, remnants of his early life at the animal shelter where such items often preceded abandonment. But his behavior suggested excitement rather than anxiety, as if he were anticipating an adventure rather than fearing displacement. Saturday morning brought the moving truck and a team of friends who'd volunteered to help with the heavy lifting. Jennifer had organized the assistance, recruiting her husband and several mutual friends who made quick work of loading furniture and boxes. The process was efficient but emotionally complex. Each room emptied felt like erasing a chapter of my life, removing evidence of relationships and experiences that had been central to my identity for the past 2 years. But there was also relief in watching my possessions disappear into the truck, creating physical and psychological space between me and the people who had demonstrated such casual disregard for my well-being. Rusty rode with me in my car to the new apartment, his excitement evident as we pulled into the complex parking lot. The dog park was visible from our second-floor unit, and several other residents were already walking their pets on the adjacent trails. The apartment itself was smaller than my room at Mom's house, but it was entirely mine. No shared spaces, no need to accommodate other people's preferences, no risk that someone would make decisions about my life or my dog without consulting me. The first night in the new apartment was strange but peaceful. Rusty explored every corner of our new home, claiming his favorite spots and settling into the rhythm of a different environment. I'd positioned his bed near the large window that overlooked the dog park, giving him entertainment and stimulation even when we were inside. As I unpacked boxes and arranged furniture, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine contentment. The apartment was quiet except for the distant sounds of other tenants and the occasional bark from the dog park. No family drama, no walking on eggshells, no need to constantly monitor other people's moods and reactions. For the first time since Rusty's disappearance, I could focus entirely on rebuilding our life together without external interference or judgment. The independence was both liberating and slightly overwhelming, but it felt like the beginning of something healthy rather than the end of something broken. Sunday morning brought our first full day in the new apartment, and I decided to celebrate by exploring the neighborhood with Rusty. The complex was located in a quiet residential area, with tree-lined streets and several parks within walking distance. We spent the morning at the largest park, where Rusty could run off-leash in a fenced area, while I watched from a nearby bench. His joy was infectious, reminding me why I'd fought so hard to get him back, and why his presence in my life was worth any amount of family discord. Other dog owners at the park were friendly and welcoming, sharing information about local veterinarians, grooming services, and pet-friendly businesses. The sense of community among pet owners was immediate and genuine, based on shared values and experiences rather than obligatory family ties. As we walked home through the neighborhood, Rusty trotting happily beside me on his leash, I felt a profound sense of rightness about the decisions I'd made. The past month had been painful and expensive, but it had also clarified priorities and relationships in ways that would benefit both of us for years to come. The apartment represented more than just a change of address. It represented autonomy, security, and the freedom to build a life based on my own values rather than compromising constantly to accommodate people who didn't share those values. Most importantly, it represented a home where Rusty and I could both be confident that our family bond was permanent and protected, immune to the whims and manipulations of people who viewed love as conditional and loyalty as negotiable. The investigation phase of my ordeal was over. I'd uncovered the truth, recovered my dog, and established consequences for the people who had betrayed us. Now the real work began, building a life that honored the lessons I'd learned about trust, family, and the difference between people who claim to love you and people who actually protect what you love. 3 months into life at the Riverside Apartments, I thought I'd successfully put the trauma of Rusty's disappearance behind me. Our new routine was comfortable and predictable. Morning runs through the neighborhood trails, workdays split between home and office, evenings at the dog park, where Rusty had made friends with a border collie named Scout and a German Shepherd mix called Tank. The other pet owners had become casual acquaintances who shared training tips and weekend hiking recommendations. But recovery from betrayal, I was learning, isn't a linear process. Just when you think you've processed the pain and moved forward, something unexpected triggers all those carefully buried emotions. For me, that trigger came in the form of a phone call on a Tuesday evening in June. I was preparing dinner when my phone rang, displaying a number I didn't recognize with a local area code. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Hello, is this Natalie Thompson? The voice was female, middle-aged, and carried a note of nervous uncertainty. Yes, this is Natalie. My name is Carol Peterson. I got your number from Patricia Mills. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I think we need to talk. Patricia Mills. The name sent an immediate chill through me. She was the woman who had facilitated Rusty's sale, the intermediary my family had used to create distance between themselves and their crime. What about? I asked, though I suspected I didn't want to hear the answer. About another dog she placed with a family. A chocolate lab named Bruno. I think something similar to what happened to you might be happening again. I sank into one of my kitchen chairs, phone pressed tightly to my ear. Rusty, sensing my distress, immediately came to sit beside me, his warm presence grounding me as Carol continued. Patricia mentioned your case when I contacted her about Bruno. She said you'd been very thorough in documenting everything, and she thought you might be willing to help me understand what legal options I have. Tell me what happened, I said, already dreading the familiar pattern of betrayal and deception I suspected I was about to hear. Bruno belonged to my daughter Sarah. She's in the military, deployed overseas for 8 months. She asked me to care for him while she was gone, and I agreed. He's such a sweet dog, well-trained, no problems at all. Carol's voice caught slightly before she continued. But my husband, he's never liked dogs. Says they're too much work, too expensive, too messy. About 6 weeks ago, he started pressuring me to get rid of Bruno. Said Sarah was being irresponsible expecting us to care for her pet for so long. The story was depressingly familiar. A family member deciding unilaterally that someone else's beloved pet was inconvenient and needed to be eliminated. I kept refusing, of course. Bruno isn't my dog to give away. But last week, while I was visiting my sister for the weekend, my husband contacted Patricia Mills and arranged for Bruno to be rehomed. When I came back Sunday evening, Bruno was gone, just like with Rusty. Just like the carefully planned deception my own family had orchestrated. What did your husband tell you when you asked where Bruno was? The same lies you probably heard. First he said Bruno had gotten out and run away. When I wanted to call animal control and search the neighborhood, he changed his story to say that Bruno had been hit by a car and died. When I demanded to know where the body was so we could bury him properly, he finally admitted what he'd actually done. I closed my eyes, remembering my own desperate search for explanations, the phone calls to veterinary clinics and grooming salons, the growing certainty that something terrible had happened combined with the inability to imagine what that something might be. Does your daughter know? I asked. Not yet, Carol said, her voice breaking. She's in Afghanistan. I can't tell her over a satellite phone that her dog is gone, but she's coming home in 2 months and I don't know how I'm going to explain this to her. The pain in her voice was raw and immediate, compounded by the additional burden of having to break this news to someone serving overseas who couldn't come home to search for her pet or confront the people responsible. Have you contacted Patricia Mills directly? I asked. That's how I found out about you. She was very apologetic, said she had no idea the dog wasn't actually my husband's to rehome. She gave me the family's contact information, but when I called them they refused to return Bruno. Said they'd already bonded with him and changed his name to Max. Max. The same name the Rodriguez family had given Rusty. Either Patricia Mills had a limited imagination for dog names, or this was part of a pattern designed to help new families psychologically distance themselves from the animal's previous identities. Did the family pay money for Bruno? $800. The same amount they charged for your dog. Apparently that's Patricia's standard fee for purebred dogs in good condition. The systematic nature of this operation was becoming clearer. Patricia Mills wasn't just facilitating individual pet rehoming situations. She was running what amounted to a dog laundering service, taking pets from people who claimed to own them and selling them to unsuspecting families for consistent fees. How many other dogs had she placed through these questionable transactions? How many other families were dealing with the devastation of unexpectedly losing beloved pets to people who viewed them as inconvenient property? I can give you my lawyer's contact information, I told Carol. He handled my case very effectively and understands the legal complexities involved. Thank you, but I'm not sure I can afford extensive legal fees. My husband and I are both retired, living on fixed incomes. This was another dimension of the crime I hadn't fully considered. While I'd been fortunate enough to have the resources necessary to pursue legal action, many people in similar situations wouldn't have that option. The emotional and financial costs of recovering stolen pets could be prohibitive for families already dealing with the trauma of sudden loss. What if there were multiple families dealing with similar situations? Could we find a way to pursue group legal action that would distribute costs while creating more pressure on Patricia Mills and the people she worked with? Carol, I said slowly, how would you feel about meeting in person to discuss this situation? I think there might be ways we can help each other, and I suspect Patricia Mills has been involved in more cases like ours than she's willing to admit. We arranged to meet for coffee the following evening at a cafe near my apartment. I spent the rest of the night researching Patricia Mills more thoroughly than I had during my own crisis, when my focus had been narrowly concentrated on recovering Rusty rather than understanding the broader scope of her activities. What I found was disturbing but not entirely surprising. Patricia Mills operated several online personas across different pet rehoming websites and social media platforms. Under various names and email addresses, she advertised her services as a pet placement specialist who helped families in transition find appropriate homes for their animals. Her websites featured testimonials from satisfied clients, photos of happy families with their newly adopted pets, and reassuring language about thorough screening processes and post-placement follow-up. Everything was designed to make her appear legitimate and caring, someone who prioritized animal welfare over profit. But a deeper investigation revealed inconsistencies and red flags that should have been obvious to anyone who looked carefully. The testimonials used generic language that could apply to any pet placement service. The photos appeared to be stock images or pictures pulled from other sources rather than actual clients. The screening processes she described were vague and unverifiable. Most tellingly, Patricia Mills had no apparent professional credentials in animal welfare, no licensing from relevant authorities, and no formal training in pet behavior or placement procedures. She was essentially a freelance broker who connected people wanting to get rid of pets with people wanting to acquire them, taking substantial fees from both sides of each transaction. I also discovered that Patricia Mills operated under at least 3 different business names across various platforms. Pet Placement Professionals, Second Chance Animal Services, and Family Pet Transitions all appeared to be the same person using different identities to expand her market reach and make her operation appear larger and more established than it actually was. The multiple business identities also provided protection against negative reviews or complaints. If one persona became associated with problems, she could simply shift her activities to a different identity and continue operating without interruption. By the time I met Carol for coffee, I had compiled a substantial file of information about Patricia Mills' methods and scope of operations. Carol arrived exactly on time, a small woman in her 60s with gray hair and tired eyes that spoke of weeks of stress and worry. She brought her own folder of documents, including printed emails from her correspondence with Patricia Mills, photos of Bruno, and a timeline of events that paralleled my own experience with uncomfortable precision. The more we compared notes, the more obvious it became that Patricia Mills had developed a systematic approach to these transactions. She used the same language in her communications, asked the same questions about the animal's temperament and training, and provided the same reassurances about finding excellent homes. She also seemed to specialize in situations involving family conflicts over pet ownership. In my case, Derek had portrayed me as an absent, irresponsible owner who couldn't properly care for Rusty. In Carol's situation, her husband had claimed that Sarah had abandoned Bruno and wasn't planning to return for him. Both stories were designed to make the potential buyers feel good about their participation in what they believed was a rescue situation. Patricia Mills wasn't just facilitating pet sales, she was creating narratives that justified separating animals from their actual owners. Carol, I said as we reviewed the documents spread across our table, I think Patricia Mills is running a much larger operation than either of us realized. Our cases aren't isolated incidents, they're part of a pattern. What do you mean? I pulled out printouts of the various business identities I'd discovered, and the testimonials that appeared across multiple websites with slight variations. She's operating under multiple names, working with people who want to get rid of pets for various reasons, and selling those animals to families who think they're participating in legitimate adoptions. The $800 fee isn't arbitrary. It's high enough to ensure serious buyers while still being accessible to middle-class families. Carol studied the evidence with growing alarm. You think she's done this to other families? I think she's built a business model around it. The question is how many other victims there are, and whether we can find them. Over the next week, Carol and I conducted our own investigation into Patricia Mills' activities. We created fake email accounts and contacted her through various platforms, posing as people with different pet placement needs. Her responses confirmed our suspicions about her systematic approach and revealed the scope of her operations. Patricia Mills was simultaneously advertising services for people wanting to rehome pets and people looking to adopt animals. She maintained separate email lists for potential buyers and sellers, matching them based on geographic location and pet characteristics, while taking fees from both sides of each transaction. Her seller communications emphasized the difficulty of finding good homes independently and the importance of proper screening to ensure pet welfare. Her buyer communications stressed the advantage of adopting from caring families rather than commercial breeders or shelters. Both sides were told that she personally knew all the families involved and could vouch for their character and circumstances. Neither side was given complete information about the other parties, creating a buffer that protected her from scrutiny while making it difficult for either buyers or sellers to verify the legitimacy of transactions. The more we learned about her methods, the more confident I became that Carol and I weren't her only victims. Someone running such a sophisticated operation wouldn't limit herself to 2 transactions. There had to be other families dealing with similar losses, other people whose beloved pets had vanished into Patricia Mills' network of buyers and sellers. Finding those families required a different approach than the direct investigation we'd been conducting. We needed to identify patterns in online complaints, social media posts, and possibly police reports that might indicate other instances of pets disappearing under suspicious circumstances. Carol suggested contacting local animal shelters and veterinary clinics to ask whether they'd heard of similar cases. Many pet owners would probably report missing animals to these organizations before considering that their pets might have been stolen and sold. This approach proved more productive than I'd expected. The staff at Riverside Animal Hospital, where I'd taken Rusty for his initial checkup after moving to my new apartment, remembered several clients who'd described suspicious pet disappearances over the past year. Dr. Martinez, the veterinarian who'd examined Rusty, was particularly helpful when I explained our investigation. You know, now that you mention it, we've had at least 4 or 5 cases in the past 18 months, where people came in asking if we'd treated their missing pets, but the circumstances never quite made sense for typical lost animal situations. What do you mean? I asked. Usually when pets go missing, it's because they escaped from yards or slipped their leashes during walks. But these cases all involved indoor pets who supposedly vanished from secure homes while their owners were away. The families were always dealing with some kind of conflict or transition situation. Dr. Martinez pulled up records on his computer, scanning through notes while Carol and I waited. Here's one: golden retriever named Buddy. Owner was a college student whose parents claimed the dog ran away while she was studying abroad. But Buddy was microchipped and well-trained, not the type of dog who would typically bolt from a familiar environment. Another case involved a couple going through divorce proceedings. The husband claimed their border collie had been hit by a car while the wife was staying with her sister, but no one could provide details about what happened to the body or which veterinary clinic had supposedly confirmed the death. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. Patricia Mills seemed to specialize in targeting pets whose owners were temporarily absent or otherwise vulnerable, working with family members who had different priorities about animal ownership. Armed with this information, Carol and I contacted David Chen, my lawyer, to discuss the possibility of expanding our investigation and potentially pursuing group legal action against Patricia Mills and her network of collaborators. David was intrigued by the evidence we'd compiled, but cautioned us about the complexity of building criminal cases against someone who operated across multiple jurisdictions and identities. What you've uncovered suggests a pattern of fraud and theft, but proving criminal intent will require demonstrating that Patricia Mills knew she was facilitating illegal transactions. If she can claim she believed the people bringing her pets were their legitimate owners, she might avoid serious criminal liability. But civil action is definitely possible, he continued. If we can identify multiple victims and document the scope of her operations, we could pursue damages for emotional distress, recovery costs, and potentially punitive damages designed to shut down her business. The first step would be finding other victims and convincing them to join a coordinated legal effort. David suggested we start by placing our own advertisements in online forums and social media groups, where pet owners might discuss missing animals. We crafted careful posts describing our situations without revealing too much about our ongoing investigation. The responses were immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours, we'd been contacted by 12 families describing similar experiences with pet disappearances that didn't fit normal patterns. 3 of those families specifically mentioned dealing with Patricia Mills or one of her business identities. Others described circumstances that matched her methods even when she wasn't mentioned by name: family conflicts over pet ownership, pets disappearing while owners were away, relatives providing contradictory explanations for the animal's whereabouts. One particularly heartbreaking case involved a military family whose German Shepherd had vanished while the father was deployed in Korea. The mother had been hospitalized for emergency surgery, and her teenage children had been staying with grandparents who'd never liked large dogs. When she returned home, the children claimed the dog had been taken to a farm where he could run free, but they couldn't provide any contact information for this supposed farm. Another family had lost their elderly beagle while dealing with a grandmother's final illness. The dog had supposedly been hit by a car while they were at the hospital, but the story kept changing, and no one could explain what had happened to the body. Each story followed variations of the same pattern: vulnerable pet owners facing crisis situations, family members who viewed the pets as burdens, and convenient explanations that fell apart under scrutiny. By the end of the week, we'd identified 8 families who were definitely dealing with situations involving Patricia Mills, and 6 more whose circumstances strongly suggested her involvement, even when her name wasn't explicitly mentioned. Carol had been handling most of the victim outreach, while I focused on documenting Patricia Mills' various business identities and online presence. The emotional toll of hearing so many similar stories of betrayal and loss was significant for both of us, but Carol seemed particularly affected by the accumulated weight of other families' pain. "I don't understand how people can do this to each other," she said during one of our evening phone calls. "These aren't strangers stealing pets from yards. These are family members betraying people who trusted them with the things they love most." Her observation captured something I'd been struggling to articulate about my own experience. The theft of property, even valuable property, was a relatively straightforward crime with clear remedies. But the theft of a beloved family member, facilitated by people who were supposed to protect and support you, created wounds that couldn't be healed through legal proceedings or financial restitution. The families we were connecting with weren't just dealing with the loss of their pets. They were grappling with the destruction of relationships they'd believed were stable and trustworthy. Parents, siblings, spouses, and children had revealed themselves capable of casual cruelty disguised as practical problem solving. As our group of victims grew, so did our collective determination to hold Patricia Mills and her collaborators accountable. We weren't just seeking the return of individual pets anymore. We were working to shut down an operation that was systematically destroying families by exploiting their internal conflicts and vulnerabilities. David scheduled a group meeting for the following Saturday, bringing together all the confirmed victims and their legal representatives to discuss coordinated action. The conference room at his office had been arranged classroom style to accommodate nearly 20 people, but the atmosphere felt more like a support group than a business meeting. Listening to each family describe their experience created a powerful sense of shared purpose. These weren't isolated incidents or random crimes. They were deliberate attacks on the bonds between people and their beloved companions, carried out by people who understood exactly how devastating their actions would be. The legal strategy David outlined was multifaceted and ambitious. Civil suits against Patricia Mills for fraud, conspiracy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Criminal referrals to law enforcement agencies in multiple jurisdictions where her activities had taken place. regulatory complaints to business licensing authorities and consumer protection agencies. But the most important element of our response would be publicity designed to warn other potential victims and shut down Patricia Mills' ability to continue operating. We would coordinate media interviews, social media campaigns, and community presentations to expose her methods and make it impossible for her to find new clients. The meeting concluded with assignments for each family and a timeline for implementing our coordinated response. Carol volunteered to handle media outreach, leveraging her background in community organizing to build public awareness. I would focus on documenting Patricia Mills' financial transactions and business practices for the criminal referrals. Other families took responsibility for social media campaigns, victim support coordination, and liaison work with animal welfare organizations that might help identify additional cases. As people filed out of the conference room, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Rusty's disappearance: genuine optimism about the possibility of justice. Not just for my own situation, but for all the families whose trust had been betrayed and whose beloved companions had been stolen. Carol lingered after the others had left, gathering her papers slowly while avoiding eye contact. "Natalie," she said finally, "I need to tell you something about Bruno's situation. Something I haven't mentioned before." "What is it?" I asked, though her tone suggested I wasn't going to like the answer. "The family who has Bruno, they live in North Carolina now. They moved there 2 weeks after the adoption because the husband got a job transfer. Even if we win our legal case, even if we can prove they have no right to keep him, getting him back is going to be much more complicated than your situation was." My heart sank. Interstate pet custody disputes were notoriously difficult to resolve, especially when months had passed and the animals had been integrated into new family situations. "Have you told your daughter?" "Not everything. I told her that Bruno is staying with a different family temporarily because of some complications at home. She thinks it's a temporary arrangement until she gets back from deployment." Carol's voice broke slightly as she continued. "I don't know how to tell her that I might not be able to get him back before she comes home. She's been talking about Bruno in every phone call, making plans for hiking trips they'll take together when she returns. He's been her emotional anchor through this deployment." The additional layer of tragedy in Carol's situation made our legal victory feel both more urgent and more uncertain. Even if we successfully shut down Patricia Mills' operation and established legal precedents for future cases, we might not be able to undo all the damage that had already been done. Some beloved companions might be permanently lost in the maze of interstate commerce and family attachments that Patricia Mills had created. Some families might never recover from the betrayals that had cost them their most treasured relationships. But we had to try. For Bruno and Rusty and all the other animals who'd been stolen from people who loved them. For the families whose trust had been shattered by people they'd believed would protect them. For the future victims who might be spared similar trauma if we could expose and stop this operation. As I drove home that evening with Rusty sleeping peacefully in the passenger seat, I reflected on how far we'd both come since those first terrifying days when he'd vanished and I'd had no idea what had happened to him. We'd built a new life together, one based on security and independence rather than the false comfort of family relationships that had proven toxic. But now we were part of a different kind of family, one united by shared experience and common purpose, rather than genetics and obligation. A family of people who understood the true value of the bonds between humans and their animal companions, and who were willing to fight to protect those bonds from people who viewed them as disposable conveniences. The battle ahead would be difficult and potentially lengthy. Patricia Mills had demonstrated considerable skill at hiding her tracks and avoiding accountability. The legal system moved slowly, especially for cases involving multiple jurisdictions and complex fraud schemes. But for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt confident that we had the resources, determination, and collective strength necessary to achieve real justice. Not just recovery of individual pets, but systemic change that would protect other families from experiencing similar betrayals. Rusty stirred in his sleep, repositioning himself so his head rested against my arm while I drove. His complete trust in my ability to protect him filled me with renewed determination to make sure that trust was never again betrayed by people who claimed to have our best interests at heart. The trap we were preparing for Patricia Mills would be far more sophisticated than the credit card scheme I'd used to catch my own family in their deception. This time we were hunting someone who had made deception her profession, someone who had refined her methods through dozens of transactions and multiple victim families. But we had advantages she couldn't anticipate. We had numbers, coordination, and most importantly, we had the accumulated fury of people whose deepest bonds had been severed for profit. That combination would prove far more powerful than Patricia Mills' careful schemes and multiple identities. The confrontation was coming, and this time there would be nowhere for her to hide. 3 weeks after our coordinated investigation launched, Patricia Mills' entire operation began crumbling. David had worked with law enforcement agencies in 4 states to execute simultaneous raids on her various business addresses. What they discovered exceeded even our worst suspicions about the scope of her criminal enterprise. Patricia Mills wasn't just facilitating individual pet thefts. She maintained detailed databases of potential targets, tracking families going through divorces, military deployments, medical crises, and other vulnerable situations where pets might become inconvenient for some family members. She had developed profiles on hundreds of animals, complete with photos, behavioral assessments, and market valuations. The evidence seized from her offices revealed sophisticated fraud operations involving forged veterinary records, fake ownership documents, and elaborate backstories designed to make stolen pets appear legitimately available for adoption. She'd been operating this scheme for over 3 years, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue while devastating countless families. When the arrests were announced, local news stations picked up our story immediately. Carol's media outreach had created exactly the publicity we'd hoped for, and reporters were eager to interview families whose beloved pets had been stolen by trusted relatives and sold through what appeared to be legitimate adoption services. The response from the community was overwhelming. Pet owners shared their own stories of suspicious disappearances, suspicious adoption experiences, and family conflicts involving animals. Several veterinary clinics reported recognizing patterns they'd previously attributed to coincidence. Animal shelters began reviewing their intake records for cases that might have involved Patricia Mills' network. Most importantly, 5 more stolen pets were identified and recovered within the first week after the arrests. Families who had purchased animals through Patricia Mills voluntarily returned them once they understood the circumstances, choosing to do the right thing despite their own emotional attachments and financial losses. Carol received the call about Bruno on a Thursday morning. The North Carolina family who had him saw the news coverage and immediately contacted David's office. They drove Bruno back to our state that same weekend, refusing any reimbursement for their expenses and asking only to say goodbye properly to the dog they'd known as Max. I accompanied Carol to the reunion, bringing Rusty along for moral support. Watching her wrap her arms around Bruno in the parking lot of David's office building was one of the most emotionally powerful moments I'd experienced since getting Rusty back. The joy, relief, and vindication in her face reflected feelings I recognized from my own reunion with my dog. Bruno seemed confused initially, but quickly warmed to Carol's familiar scent and voice. Within minutes he was behaving like the well-trained, affectionate companion she'd described, clearly recognizing her as someone important in his life, despite the months of separation. The legal proceedings moved swiftly once Patricia Mills' operation was fully exposed. She pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges, including fraud, conspiracy, and theft, accepting a plea agreement that included 5 years in prison and full restitution to all identified victims. Her cooperation with authorities also led to charges against several family members who had knowingly participated in stealing pets for profit. Derek, Mom, and Emma were among those charged as co-conspirators, though their sentences were lighter due to their limited involvement and cooperation with the investigation. Derek received 18 months in county jail and 3 years probation. Mom and Emma received probation and community service, plus substantial financial penalties that would take them years to repay. The civil lawsuit against Patricia Mills and her network resulted in a 7-figure settlement that was distributed among victim families. While no amount of money could compensate for the emotional trauma we'd endured, the financial recovery helped cover legal costs and provided resources for pet-related expenses, like veterinary care, training, and boarding facilities. More importantly, the publicity surrounding our case led to legislative changes designed to prevent similar crimes. Several states passed laws requiring detailed documentation for pet transfers, creating criminal penalties specifically for family members who steal and sell relatives' animals, and establishing better tracking systems for animals sold through private networks. My relationship with Mom and Emma remained strained but gradually improved over the following year. The legal consequences they faced, combined with seeing the devastation their actions had caused other families, seemed to create genuine remorse rather than just defensive anger. We established boundaries that protected my independence while allowing for cautious rebuilding of trust. Derek characteristically blamed everyone except himself for the consequences of his actions. Even after serving his jail sentence, he maintained that he'd been trying to help by finding Rusty a better home. Our relationship remained severed, and I felt no desire to repair it. The most lasting change wasn't in my family relationships, but in my understanding of what family actually means. Blood relatives who could steal from me and lie to me weren't really family in any meaningful sense. But Carol, the other victims we'd worked with, and even the Rodriguez family who had returned Rusty voluntarily, had shown more genuine care for my well-being than my actual relatives. 6 months after Patricia Mills' sentencing, Carol's daughter Sarah returned from deployment. The reunion between Sarah and Bruno was everything Carol had hoped for, full of the joy and relief that military families experience when they're finally reunited after long separations. Sarah had no idea how close she'd come to losing Bruno permanently, and Carol decided not to burden her with those details. Rusty and I settled into a peaceful routine at Riverside Apartments, surrounded by neighbors who respected our bond and a community that understood the value of human-animal relationships. He never showed signs of trauma from his brief separation, seeming to view the entire experience as an unfortunate adventure that had ultimately led to a better living situation. I kept in touch with several families from our victim support group, sharing updates about legal proceedings and celebrating as more stolen pets were recovered through ongoing investigations. Our coordinated response had created a network of people committed to protecting others from similar crimes. The final resolution came almost a year after Rusty's disappearance, when I received a handwritten letter from the little girl whose family had purchased him from Patricia Mills. She wrote to tell me that they'd adopted a rescue puppy from the local animal shelter, a dog who really needed their family, rather than one who'd been stolen from someone who loved him. Her letter included a drawing of Rusty with his new family, and a promise that she would always remember him as Max, but understood that his real name was Rusty, and his real family was with me. The maturity and compassion in her words reminded me that some people, regardless of age, understand instinctively what others never learn, that love creates obligations, not just privileges. That evening, I sat in my apartment with Rusty sleeping beside me, reading through the accumulated documentation of our ordeal. Police reports, legal briefs, victim statements, media coverage, and personal correspondence that chronicled months of betrayal, investigation, and ultimately justice. The papers would go into storage, evidence of a chapter in our lives that had ended with recovery and accountability. But the lessons would remain permanent parts of who we'd become, more cautious about trust, more protective of what we valued, more aware of the difference between people who claimed to care and people who actually protected what we loved. Rusty stretched in his sleep, repositioning himself so his head rested against my leg, completely secure in the knowledge that his place in our family was permanent and protected. That security, hard-won through months of struggle, was worth every moment of pain we'd endured to achieve it. Outside our window, other families in the apartment complex were ending their days with their own beloved companions, all of us sharing the quiet satisfaction of bonds that had survived whatever challenges life had presented. We were part of a community built on genuine respect for the relationships that mattered most, rather than obligations imposed by genetics or convenience. The betrayal that had nearly cost me everything had ultimately led to something better, a life built on authentic connections, rather than false assumptions about family loyalty. Sometimes the greatest gift comes disguised as the worst tragedy, teaching lessons that transform loss into wisdom and pain into strength. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.